Yay! Okay. Cool. Take it away. Thank you so much. Okay. I've talked a bit about very general approaches to using computational methods in philosophy of science, ways of letting you read from a distance. But what have we been doing actually here in Tilburg? So let's get a bit more specific. So we talked about these citation networks, and they've been really useful for a lot of scientists because they can't read all of the research in biomedicine, for example. And there were cases where it really helped people discover medically important compounds and so on that they couldn't have found just by reading their journals by themselves. But these formalized citations are something that's quite specific to modern science. And if we're interested in the history of philosophy, maybe new articles you read now, the articles you write now, they have these citation standards. But it's quite soon you'll find a cutoff where people are a lot more informed about how they do it. But on the other hand, referring to other people's work is a very old practice. We have that in antiquity. People, first they mention other people's work, even if it's just to admire Aristotle, because it was so important. And so we thought, how can we extend this method of citation studies to historical inquiry in philosophy? So if you look at, this is a random journal article, there's no citation on this page, but you find a lot of names mentioned, right? So you're referring to other people, Zeno, Kant, James, Whitehead. These are all something that's similar to citation links. It's references to other people's work that appears in a philosophy context. So what we started with is the idea to making use of these kinds of links, what we call dimensions. So mention is a generalized form of citation. Usually cite a document by mentioning its authors. And where we don't have citation links to documents, we now look at these general references from documents to authors by mentioning their name. Very wordy way of saying something very simple. You talk about the people who you read. So if a citation is a link between a document and another document, a mention is a link between a document and a scholar. This is quite different, but in the case of philosophy, it works quite well because we have a lot of single-authored works, and there's usually some kind of coherent unity over the work of an individual person's philosophical output. So the realization of this link, the syntax, if you want, is normally the proper name of that person. So how do we refer to Nathan? By saying Nathan. In more formal context, I might say Professor Wildman, and so on. So this is the sort of syntax we need to find these kinds of links. And the ingredients for our study, so I'm leaving out here a lot of the bigger context. The project in which this was developed is a study of the history of logical empiricism, in particular how it affected American philosophy in the 1930s, because a lot of European philosophers had to emigrate into the United States. And then that quickly changed American philosophy, which was dominated by pragmatist philosophers, to the logical emphasis that you already encountered. So this is an important period in the history of philosophy, and we wanted to systematically study what changed over that time. With that question in view, you can think about what kind of corpus you want to work with. These are 12 English-speaking journals. Some of them are British, Synthese from the Netherlands, and some American journals. Over this period, they have 23,000 articles, and we have some good metadata, which is also important to keep track of what's happening where. And then we decided to what you could call a top-down approach. So bottom-up would mean you just take this corpus and then try to find all the names of people that appear in there, and then somehow these are the kind of references you look at. But of course, philosophers don't only talk about philosophers, they also talk about presidents, other intellectuals, priests, who knows, fictional characters and so on. So to keep all of these questions of distinction aside, we start with a top-down version. We have a database of philosophers to look for. So we look for the references to 44,000 different names. And then we try to turn these mentions of names into these generalized citations, these mentioned links from documents to individual authors. And the main problem is, of course, that there's ambiguity. You might always know that Carnap is Carnap, but there's different ways in which people refer to Carnap exactly. They might write R.Carnap, U.Carnap, and also a lot of people are not sure if it's an F or a PH. And in fact, there's a lot of published references to Carnap that spell his name wrong. But we figured out that this should be just considered a spelling variant of his name. So for all of these names, we've collected spelling variants, common mistakes, abbreviations. Sometimes people leave out the middle name and so on. So in the end, it's 140,000 different syntactical elements, basically, that we're looking for in this corpus. And the big problem we have here, so let's look at this. Here's just somebody mentioning James. There's so many people called James. How do we find out who we're referring to here? How do we even know that this is the last name? So the big problem we have that citations in a way would have solved for us is the extreme ambiguity of a lot of these names that appear here. So nowadays you can cite articles with unique identifier, DOIs. You've probably seen a digital object identifier. It's a number, and it clearly tells you what is the document you're referring to. This is the clearest way of citing things. If we go back to history of philosophy, this is not how people talked about each other. They just say, well, Wittgenstein had this question recently, and then the people they are addressing, they of course knew who he was talking to, but if you're trying to do distant reading, you somehow need to give enough context to your algorithms that they learn or that they manage to find out who is meant by James in a context like this. So we currently use 4 different disambiguation strategies. We have some more in the build to try and improve this even further. So first we look at the article level. If there's a mention of William James, we assume that the other Jameses, if there's no mention to a different James in the same article, we assume that they're all William James, only if there's no other James mentioned in that article. Then the oeuvre level means if somebody is not mentioned anywhere, so we have 44,000 philosophers, but some of them might be obscure philosophers in France who work in a specific question of theology that might not have been important in this particular corpus that we looked at. So if they don't appear anywhere in the corpus, then we say maybe it's one of the other Jameses that we want to look at. And then 2 other methods. And the most complicated one is using the existing co-mentions between authors and calculate is this context in which this James has been mentioned similar enough to other James that have been mentioned But only if it's much more similar than the other Jameses, then we decide that this is a reference to William James rather than the others. That in the end identifies maybe 90%, or disintermediates maybe 90% of these references, especially with this citation angle calculation. There are still some issues with it, so that's why we still work on improving this. If any of you is interested in programming, wants to include it as part of philosophy, please let me know. Also in testing, asking new questions. We're very interested in hearing what you think, what you would like to see for using this. The full story of how this database was built is in this article, and also linked in the Canvas page. But I also wanted to give you a chance to see it a bit for yourself. So this is probably not recorded anymore. Can I share this? Yeah. I'll do it. Okay, the closest image. Sure. Perfect. Yeah. So we've built this database and we've asked some of the questions that arose in the context of our project. You've seen the co-citation network I mentioned earlier, and we tested the question of what's the relation between empirical scientists and philosophers of science, and how did it change over the decades. But of course, there's a lot of other questions people might be interested in. There's a lot of other information hidden in all of these mentioned relations. So we wanted to make it available to other researchers with questions that we maybe don't anticipate, and also to students who want to find a new way to maybe get interested in an author that's different from just going to Google Scholar. So you can have on this website a list of all the philosophers for who we have extracted mentions. So I said we have 44,000 names. Only about 10,000 of those actually appear in this corpus. So there's a lot of extra names that we get at them, for example, from Wikipedia and from some other sources. A lot of them don't appear in this English-speaking corpus. Here are just the top ones that are sorted. But you can also then say, I want to know something about philosophy in the post-war period, let's say 1945 to 60. Who was talked about right after the war? And then you see, okay, the names seem familiar, but maybe I want to know the newer people who were born within the 20th century, and you see, oh, turns out that even in this English-speaking corpus, Sartre was actually a really big guy, and then Charles Morris, other people. Depending on who you're interested in, you can look at the information we have about this particular person. For example, the number of mentions we have collected. And you can also look at what these mentions are, and where they appear and when. So here you have the context. This is important for, especially for smaller figures or people who you didn't expect, because sometimes there will be false positives. There's, for example, a philosopher called Weise, who I was surprised by being very prominent, but it turns out there were people quoting German, parts of German manuscripts, and Weise is a capitalized word in German, of course. And then this was considered to be a mention to this philosopher. working on new algorithms to avoid this kind of situation. But what I'm saying here is we give you the context to be transparent about how good the quality of data is for a particular person that you're looking at. If you go to Google Scholar and you just have the number of citations, you can't really inspect where it comes from and so on. Or this is a bit more transparent, I think. But what is this useful for? I mean, of course, you can go and just read through the number of articles in which Sartre is mentioned, maybe in a particular year, if you're writing a dissertation about Sartre. In the case of Sartre, he's not an author in our corpus. Otherwise, you could look at mentions by Sartre within these journals as well. But you can also create specific networks that are focusing on a particular figure. So you can see here that Sartre, for example, has often been mentioned together with Descartes. And then, on the one hand, you can look at Descartes if you're interested in Descartes now. But you can also look at all the articles that mention Sartre and Descartes together. So, for example, here's this article by Catherine Rao from 49 that has 50 mentions to Sartre and 20 mentions to Descartes. I think if you're writing a thesis about, it's quite common now to talk about the intersection or the influence of a particular person on somebody else. This can be a good way of finding existing research about this that might have been forgotten. So this is not the kind of ranking you get if you just go to Google Scholar and see what's the most cited paper.
You talked about the intersection or intersectionality. What about philosophers that have had influence on somebody, but they don't necessarily cite them? So like, for example, somebody has read a lot of Nietzsche and has been inspired a lot by it, but they don't necessarily need it for a paper, but it has influenced the way they think. You wouldn't find it in a system like this.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, there are ways in which these networks are defined. But so let's say the author you're interested in never mentions Nietzsche in their work, but is really inspired by it. If there's somebody else who picks up on that, who writes maybe articles about Nietzsche on relativism and this other person on relativism or a similar view, then you have a co-mention link between it, right? So even if that author doesn't actually mention Nietzsche, that will still put them closer together, because, for example, here, Sartre is not an author in our corpus, right? He has not published in any of these journals we're looking at. But other people, like here, Catherine Rao, they mention Sartre and Descartes in the same document, and this is what creates a link between them. So this is another advantage of this using this co-mention relation. Because Kant, of course, can't talk about people in the 20th century, but we can still place Kant interestingly in a network, because you can place modern philosophers in the same context as people who are long dead, and this way we can say something about how they're related to each other. And I think maybe something like that could also be interesting for the case that you mentioned. Of course, this is not a perfect map of this is who has influenced this person. That's incredibly strong to settle. Like, who's the major influence? Probably in the end, the most authoritative way of doing that is to say the Habermas who has influenced you, and then he tells you that that's maybe the most authoritative way of doing this. But other than that, you have, here we're relying on other people making those kinds of connections. But it's a very good question. And then, of course, from here you might end up discovering that there's Jean Wahl. You didn't maybe know that you were interested in him, and then look at who discusses Jean Wahl and so on. So the idea is that you jump through different networks, and maybe you find philosophers you didn't know that used to be actually discussed a lot with the philosopher you're interested in. So, of course, you know Kant, you know Hegel, and so on, or whoever you're interested in. But there might be some figures surrounding them that were very influential, maybe in the 1960s, maybe 1930s, that you haven't heard of. This is a way to find interesting articles by them. And we've also been experimenting. So I mentioned earlier that you have to make assumptions about how to calculate the strength of links between authors in these networks, and also experimenting with ways to emphasize smaller figures. So one problem you have, of course, if you look at these networks, there's some really big names that dominate everything because they're always mentioned with everyone. Kant, especially, it's just everywhere. So you'll always be a big node. But we can take this into account and say we lower the weights to people who are just everywhere and just emphasize those who only appear together with this philosopher a bit. The precise mathematical formulation of that is a bit tricky. And there's a lot of pragmatic trying it out. Does this look useful or not? So this is an experimental feature, but is the advisor person that I talked about is not actually somebody. But using this method, for example, you could find some other philosophers that might be more relevant than just always being linked to Kant. For example, here it seems that Bataille and Jean-Mal, they belong together. I did not. I was not aware of that. It's a bit of a cluster, yeah. So this is a problem where I have to work a bit on the layout of these things. But the idea is that you can then easily find the articles that link those two together. And in this case, okay, it's only one mention to Joval, but a lot of mentions to Louis Laval. Maybe this is not actually so important. But of course, this is all abstract. These are all the metadata. In the end, you want to read philosophy, you want to go back to it. So of course, you can just go and then have whatever article you were looking at, and then read the whole thing. This is not supposed to be something you do instead of doing the philosophy, but a way of reading philosophy. Maybe finding authors that you otherwise wouldn't read. Because we have this, as we mentioned before, all the citations, they cluster. They all go always to the same people, and the longer in the past it is, the more this happens. There are so many authors from the 1910s that nobody knows anymore. This is maybe a way of finding out that there were actually some important contributions later, even if they're not cited nowadays anymore. And yeah, there's of course more stuff, but if you want, you can just go on unidentified.org and try it out yourself. And if any of you is maybe inclined to program a bit, you can also show this. You can also use the query language SQL to learn a bit about what we have in our database. That's a bit more advanced. It's worthwhile to learn, I think. So here you see how many mentions were disambiguated by which method, how many were left ambiguous, and so on. And you can do all kinds of statistics from this kind of interface. But if you're interested in doing something more specific, for example, you want to know how somebody got forgotten, let me show you just this. This works better if people are very prominent, of course, then it's a bit smoother. But you can also look at when people were discussing a person more. Bergson is maybe a good person to demonstrate this with.
Does anybody know who he is?
Okay, yeah, but 100 years ago you would have totally known. So
he was the philosopher, basically, at the turn of the century. He was one of the most influential philosophers in the world, insanely cited, insanely influential, and is just gone.
I mean, yeah, it's a French philosopher and still has this extreme influence, or is still very prominent, even just in the English-speaking corpus. This is not even the French corpus,
yeah.
But it's a very big, very prominent figure. but you can very nicely see how this declines and take into account that there's more and more articles being published later. So naturally, it should explode, but it's really the opposite. The trend downwards is strong enough that it's still at the curve looks like this. Are we running out of time? Yes.
Wrap it up soon.
Okay, I think at that point, I'll leave it. If you want to play around more with it, you can also create networks yourself. Do it at home at your leisure. And if you want to learn more about it, let me know. We're always interested in seeing what kind of questions people have. You don't need to know how to program. If you do, of course, it's also great. And let me know if you're interested in digital methods.
Thank you very much, Gregor. So basically, again, what we kind of did today was we talked through, kind of, in terms of what we've been doing, this sort of first order or lower order tool that we might use to address particular philosophical questions, right? And remember, in the previous couple lectures, we've been talking about kind of higher order, if you like, questions about what even counts as doing philosophy or how we might structure questions. What we're going to talk about next week is more in line with thinking about the tools we can use to answer particular questions. But it's actually going to challenge us with thinking about how we can answer questions. What sort of questions are we even in a position to do? And we've called it kind of situated epistemology, but really this is better construed as something like feminist critiques of analytic philosophy. So the readings for next week, there's two. We've got a paper from Anne Gary called A Minimally Decent Philosophical Method. I'd ask you to read that one. And then there's a section from the Stanford Encyclopedia that Gregor mentioned earlier from Elizabeth Anderson. Read, I think it's sections 1, 2, and 4. So all that's on the Canvas page. That's all set up for you. I'm also going to try and talk a little bit next week about the structure of the midterm exam, because I hope by that then I will also be made aware of what the midterm exam is supposed to be like. Because again, it's going to be on TestVision, and I have to confess I've never set up an exam on TestVision before. But don't stress, it's going to be basically open questions of the kind of format like we've had on the Canvas page about sort of study questions sort of things. So I'll definitely block some time for next week so we can talk about those. But I think before we wrap up, we should thank Gregor for the guest lecture. So, and thanks for coming, guys. Have a lovely, lovely rest of the week. And we'll see you all next Thursday morning.